My great pleasure to welcome Ambassador Bob Ray to the Max Bell School. We wish we were welcoming him to the sixth floor of 680 Sherbrooke, which is where we are. But unfortunately, in the world we're in, and I'm predicting from this past week, the world we're going to be in for a while, we're going to have to use these crazy hybrid formats. I think it's hard to imagine a figure who straddles the subjects better than Bob Ray, for many of you who are part of the school, given that he was, of course, the Premier of Ontario, which, when you look at the size and complexity of the policy challenges that the students have been looking at, could be a state of its own. In many parts of the world, there are smaller states than that, but who's also played a number of roles inside and outside government, both in terms of domestic Canadian public policy on issues of arbitration and mediation, but also through his roles internationally, which, while this current one is obviously in some senses the pinnacle, Bob Ray was also very active in the Sri Lankan conflict through his work with the Forum for Federations. And I think, interestingly, for many of us, myself included, as a special envoy for the Canadian government with respect to the situation of the Rohingya in Myanmar, and wrote what was, for many, a really arresting and hard-hitting report about the world's indifference to the plight of the Rohingya. But now he is Canada's permanent representative and ambassador in New York, where, as we know, the politics are incredibly difficult today. So his political skills are much in demand, but also dealing with issues that I know from reading his work and following his career, he's very passionate about, including human rights, economic development, and at the moment, he's going to talk more about this, the very unequal effects of the COVID pandemic around the world. So we're going to have some opening questions, and then I hope some time for questions at the end. So I'm going to try to be brief and not hog all the time. But I have a few questions that I wanted to kick off with. And I guess the first is situating us a little bit historically, because I often find, and I'm guilty of this myself, that every generation thinks they're living through exceptional times. And I wanted to get a sense from you about how, in your current role, but also generally, how the world really does feel different in terms of its challenges, compared even to, say, 2005, which was the last time Canada systematically reviewed its foreign policy, but also when we had the 60th anniversary of the UN and lots of reforms within the UN system. So I wanted to start with that first question about what are the key differences, and I guess what are the really striking features of our current global context that you work with every day?
Well, when you think about it, first of all, Jen, it's great to be with you, and it's great to be with all the students out there and faculty and whoever's listening. I mean, I think if you think about it, there was 6 years between 1945 and 1939. So it's not about length of time, right? I mean, that was a cataclysmic event in which millions of people died, in which billions and trillions of dollars were spent, and in which the world came out of it a very, very different place than it went in. This perhaps is being a little melodramatic and a little kind of slight exaggeration, but not completely. We really need to understand that right now we're in the middle of at least 3 major disruptive events, of which COVID is one, in which millions have died, trillions of dollars have been spent and lost, in terms of lost production. Climate change, whose impacts we're feeling every day in every part of the world. Again, with costs, huge mammoth economic and social implications. The digital revolution, which is yet another major technological revolution, every bit as disruptive as the original industrial revolution was, and then all the other tech changes that have happened since the middle of the 18th century. So that's kind of like a lot, right? I mean, that's, you sort of look at that and say, wow, that is, are we going? So the answer is 2005, or the 60th anniversary of the UN, is, frankly, it's light years away from where we are today. And the question really for us, I think, is, can we be as successful as some other generations have been in understanding the significance of the changes and responding to them in a truly enlightened and positive way? And that's a tall order. But yeah, we're in the middle of a very, very dramatic moment. Of which the one good thing that one can say is, and this also applies to all the conflicts and other things that are associated with what's going on in the world, is that there are no national solutions to these problems. There is no alternative architecture to the one that we have. So it's not as if you could say, well, we could create something different, or we could build something else. You could, but it would be a huge, exaggeratedly wasted effort. You've really got to just use the architecture you've got, but you've got to completely change the narrative, create some new institutions and some new ways of responding, definitely. But you've got to add to what we've done so far.
And of course, the other big change that I wanted to ask you about, certainly from 1945, but even from 2005, which is only 15 years ago, is the reality of the rise, or I would like to call it reemergence, of Asia as a dominant site of power globally. So in 1945, it was mainly Western countries who were designing those institutions. And so given that you're working within that multilateral system very actively, I wanted to ask you about how you see the impact of that rise or reemergence on multilateralism generally, but also within the UN itself. I started to see some of that, but that was already 6 or 7 years ago. And I imagine that it's much more striking now.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the return of China to a place of real predominance and influence in the world. I say return, I mean, the period from the middle of the 19th century to 1980 was a period of real chaos and destruction. And China, which had been a very powerful country, although not one of which people were necessarily very aware before 1850, but it nevertheless, in the region and in its own self-assessment, the Middle Earth, it saw itself as at the center of the world. That was destroyed. So you're quite right to talk about the return of China, and that's, I think, in many respects how President Xi even describes it to his fellow Chinese citizens, of saying that we are returning to the place where we have always been in the world and where we should be, and that's what we're doing. It has a huge impact. I think, ironically, we've had several revolutionary leaders in China. Sun Yat-sen, who was the sort of the democratic leader who tried to create a nation out of the chaos of the post-imperial era, and the Japanese invasion and internal fighting. It destroyed, didn't build on that very much, but You then had Mao Zedong, who's the revolutionary leader who brought an end to multi-parties and brought discipline to the entire system, but also great destruction. A huge loss of life in China in the 1950s as a because of the famine produced by the so-called Great Leap Forward, which was a great leap backward. Huge loss of life, which people don't often talk about in the Cultural Revolution as a result of what happened. And it wasn't until 1980 with Deng Xiaoping, who really created stability and opening the economy as sort of, these are things which we're going to do in China. And he really set the stage. But now we have with President Xi, we're not quite sure. I think we're in the middle of it, that he himself represents another key and greater and more expansive view of how China is going to take its place in the world. And certainly their attitude, the Chinese attitude to the UN is very interesting. The Russians' attitude to the UN is to put as many crowbars into the machinery as they possibly can. The Chinese are not doing that. They do some of that, but most of what they do is to say, we want to make this institution more reflective of this newly expanded role for China. And the Chinese narrative now is very much one that is explicitly talking about the decline of the West, the decline of the United States, and the rise of China to a position of global power. And it is transformative in terms of what potentially it means for the UN, for our battles and struggles at the UN and the General Assembly and elsewhere. But it's also, I think, beyond the UN itself as an organization, it has a lot. It will have an enormous impact on the global economy and global politics.
And of course, another aspect of China's current status, but also its relationship with the US, has been the way in which COVID and the pandemic has been caught up in geopolitics. But I wanted to ask you a few questions about COVID and the pandemic, since I know it's occupying a huge chunk of your daily schedule,
Yeah.
I'm sure. And you've written about this, Ambassador Ray, and spoken about how the pandemic has revealed the deep levels of inequality that we have both between countries and within them. But you've also said that it did not make us more global in our outlook. And perhaps you could start with just what are the reasons for that failure to think globally, which we continue to see with the reactions in the last 3 or 4 days to the new variant.
Well, I mean, I think to put it in its simplest form, ask yourself as a citizen of Canada, where do you look to provide you with the security that you feel you need against the pandemic? And the answer is you look to your national government. You look to your government to make sure you get a vaccine. Make sure you get a vaccine as quickly as possible, and you make sure that your family gets vaccinated, and make sure that your kids get vaccinated and younger kids get vaccinated, and then you get your booster when you need your booster. So, I mean, in its simplest terms, what level of government has been strengthened by what's happened around the world is the national government. And so we look to that government as the place that's going to solve the problem. And that government itself understands that it's in a democratic context, its support depends on the will of the people. And so if Mr. Trudeau were to have said, or were to say now, well, as much as I love my fellow citizens, I really believe this is a global problem, and therefore we're going to have to take less and everybody else is going to have to get more. That's not a practical position for a prime minister to take. He can't take that position if he or she is interested in re-election. So I take a sort of more practical view, and that is to say, my job is to say, well, you know what, if we really want to deal with the core issues around the pandemic, we have to understand that it is a global virus. The virus is not a citizen of Canada, and the virus is not an exclusively Canadian enemy. The virus is a virus. It's floating around the universe. It's mutating. Once if it's being resisted by a successful vaccine, it then says, "Oh, I've got a better idea," and develops new spikes, and then goes off and infects other people. So that's the first thing we have to say. It's a global problem. So Canada has quite rightly spent part of its money, not a large portion of its money, I would say, but part of its money has been spent on saying, well, how do we encourage more distribution of the vaccine? How do we encourage greater capacity on the part of developing countries to take in the vaccine? Right now, more than half the world's population has received one vaccine. But having said that, the distribution of that vaccine has not been equal, because the world is not an equal place. The capacities are not equal. The companies that invented the vaccine say it's our vaccine. And there's a whole debate around, well, how do you share that intellectual property effectively so you can expand production? And that's something that, the WTO is working on, engaging on. But I don't think any of us should be surprised about the fact that nationalism has been strengthened. And I think it's going to take a lot of very explicit effort for global institutions to play the role which they should be playing. And essentially, the problem with global institutions is they don't tax anybody. They require donations from nation states. The largest piece of furniture in the Secretary General's office is a begging bowl. He simply has to ask for money. It's a very frustrating job in that sense, because he doesn't get to raise money by taxes and say, well, I'm going to get 1% of all of the taxes that are raised in the world will come to the UN. He can't do that. It's not a global government. And sometimes I think it's mistakenly thought that the UN is a global government. It's not. We're in the baby phase of global governance, tiny first little steps.
And so what should the priorities be then for those institutions? So if we're thinking about, given that the reflex of national governments is going to be, we need to take care of our own citizens.
First.
Although there might be a kind of residual, we're prepared to talk about also contributing to global solutions. What should the priorities be? There's so many different proposals on the table. And I've talked to my students about, there's a cottage industry of kind of now expert commissions, right? This is what we do when we have a global problem. We create panels and we create reports and we diagnose the problem. But if we wanted to prioritize in what is, perhaps a short window, right? Because I don't know if you would agree, but there's also a psychological desire on the part of many to get back to normal, whatever normal will look like. And so the window for that creative action to take place is maybe not as long as we might like. So we have to prioritize. And where would you prioritize, and where do you think Canada should be prioritizing its efforts?
I think there are two or three. I mean, there are a few priorities, but I think we have to defeat the virus. I think defeating the virus has to be the first global priority. And I think that until we're able to do that, and until we're able to deal with the issue of a broader and deeper capacity on the part of the world to become more resilient to the presence of these pandemics, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for us to make a whole lot of progress on other things. I think climate change is a huge crisis and a huge challenge. But I think we have to, if you said to me, what would you pick as your first priority? I'd say my first priority is to get the world not only vaccinated, but protected. And as I said, to actually defeat the virus. We've defeated many viruses. We've defeated polio. We've defeated lots of infectious diseases. We've defeated them. But we did it by just saying, we're going to do this.
Mhm.
And I think there has to be this absolute resolve to say, we are going to do this. We are globally, we are going to have to succeed in defeating the virus. And it's, I agree with you. We don't mean say we haven't got that long a window, because many people say, I've had it with the virus. Okay, I get it. The virus hasn't had it with us. You got to remember that. You've got to understand the nature of the enemy, and that, I think, is something we it's like saying, I'm tired of World War II. I'm tired of the Nazis. I'm tired of fighting these guys. And you sort of say, yeah, but they're not tired of us. They haven't changed their goal. We said, okay, we're going to defeat them. We have to defeat these. We have to be an unconditional surrender. And there has to be an unconditional surrender when it comes to the virus. And that is the challenge that's facing us. It's a diversion in many ways from all the other things we'd like to be doing, but I think it has to be the singular focus of the global community, because without it, we're not going to have global prosperity. We're not going to have freedom of movement, freedom of travel. We're not going to be able to deal effectively with climate change, with a bunch of other things, because countries are simply not going to be able to respond effectively until we've defeated it.
Can I just sneak in one more question about that before I move on? And I know there's tons of people will have questions, but when you talk about what's required to defeat the virus, so part of it is about vaccines. How much of it is also, because you talked about the capacity of countries to be more resilient. How much do you think the current moment, therefore, offers developing countries some leverage? And what I mean by that is, have the politics become more amenable to developing countries saying, if we want to defeat the virus, there are also resources and capacities that we need, and that they may be in a position now that they weren't in 6 to 8 years ago, to really pressure those who have resources and capacity to share to do so in a way that's more compelling than it has been to date. I guess I'm asking, can they be much more explicitly political in asking for the kinds of things they need for that deeper resilience?
I believe they can, and I believe they should, and I believe they will. A little known thing happened at a G7 meeting recently, where a number of countries, including Canada, said to South Africa, we will pay you, and we will invest in a technology hub that will allow you to build the vaccine, to make the vaccine. And Moderna, again, this has not been widely publicized, said, well, you can use our technology. We're not going to tell you how to do it, but we're not going to come after you if we find that you've used our intellectual property. So effectively, they've kind of waived. This is like a kind of a quiet TRIPS waiver, and that's happened, and it's happening. And South Africa is going to take advantage of that. I think there are many other places and other ways in which countries can quite rightly say to the world, look, we are, the variant that's coming out of our country is going to kill you. So what can we do to stop it? The virus does not carry a national flag. It is not virus is not a Canadian citizen. It's a global animal, and so we have to deal with it in that context. And so, one of the things that I've been saying to my government, and a lot of my job, by the way, involves advocating as much at home as it does abroad, and saying to my government, look, this isn't money for other people. This isn't we're giving something to somebody else because we're nice. We're investing in these projects because it's in our interest to do this. It's in our direct economic, financial interest to make these investments, just as surely as it is to invest in a factory in Canada or to encourage the investment of a creation of technology in Canada. This is good for us. It's not just good for South Africa or for India or for any other countries that are developing these technology hubs.
Yeah, so you provided some validation that one of the things I think diplomats do is, engage in persuasive action about how to conceive of the national interest and how to communicate it, right? What is in our national interest? So you have behind you the flag of the UN, and one of the core purposes, if you read the charter of the UN, is to save future generations from the scourge of war, right? So the war that they had in mind in 1945 was, war between great powers. We may have that again.
I have my copy right here.
Yes, exactly. Good for you. We may have that kind of war again, and we can talk about that as well. But a lot of the wars we now confront are civil wars, even if they have varying levels of international involvement. So I had a couple questions for you here. And the first is how we process the fallout from NATO countries' withdrawal from Afghanistan in terms of it affecting developed countries' willingness to engage in civil conflicts.
It's a huge question. I mean, I would just say, I think the way in which the withdrawal happened, starting with one could, going back time, but looking at what President Trump did, I mean, I think his decision to negotiate directly with the Taliban, I think that all of that, the fallout from that, and then President Biden's, setting a date, saying we're done by then, and that's the old joke, right? You've got you can set the time you want. We're still around here. We're not guided by your timetable. So I mean, to me it was very badly done, and we're living with the impact of it. So I don't think it's just the leaving of Afghanistan. I don't think it's just Afghanistan. I think it's the challenges of the interventions in Iraq and the lack of an effective strategy in Syria, the lack of an effective strategy in Yemen, the lack of a strategy in Ethiopia. Yeah, I think there is a lot of evidence to show that one thing we haven't yet figured out, and this has to do with some basic UN principles like the duty to protect that you've been very involved in developing, Jennifer, and others have been involved in that too. It's one thing to say, here's the principles, but the other thing is say, okay, how do we do this? Because if there's going to be a military intervention, how do we ensure its success? And I think it's not just Western governments, it's the UN itself, which is looking at intervention and saying, how do we do this more effectively? And I think one of the things that we're seeing at the UN is one of the institutions created at the 60th anniversary was the Peace Building Commission. And how do we use the Peace Building Commission more creatively to get us to a better place? And I think that's where we need to be thinking much more creatively. Well, how do we break down the conflicts within countries, and how do we successfully move forward? And in many ways, the military intervention, when it often comes way too late. It's not well thought out. These things do not lend themselves to a purely military solution. There will have to be a security element of any effective intervention, but that can take a whole variety of forms in terms of dealing with the origins of the conflict. But yeah, I mean, I think we would all be, people like you and others would be able to take us through the amount of money and the amount of of lives and the suffering that we've caused or been caused by these internal conflicts and the attempted resolution, and say this is a bad way to do it. Don't do this again.
Yeah.
Has had that, sure, it's had that impact. I mean, we don't do a very good job of learning stuff from, what have we done wrong? How can we do it right? There are fields of endeavor, like, for example, we have now effectively eradicated polio. Doesn't mean it can't come back. It's still around out there, but we've really effectively eradicated it. How did we do that? And there's very little time spent on lessons learned and saying, how do we make these interventions work? But we've worked more successfully in some of those health interventions than we've been able to do on social and political interventions, which have not been as successful.
Yeah, I mean, Ethiopia is an interesting case that you brought up in terms of, if we're not going to have boots on the ground, how do countries engage with a conflict like that? When you look back at that, I mean, you're obviously still addressing it at the moment, and the Security Council's discussing it as well. Do you, either looking at other cases where things have worked, do you think there are things we could have or should have done earlier to prevent what we're seeing?
Well, I mean, I think one of the real problems is you've got to, sorry, I'm getting a phone call here, which I don't think I can successfully turn off. I'll try.
Okay.
It may just go away by itself.
Let's hope so.
One of the ways we've got to, I mean, it's like healthcare, right? Early intervention is always better. And I mean, one could say an obvious thing: don't declare victory by, saying, that, this problem is now solved. This is a settled situation. We've been involved in the Peacekeeping Commission. We've been involved. Canada's been very directly involved in a number of discussions in countries where we've said, yeah, we think you're ready to graduate from the program. Like, we're happy that you came to see us. The Peacekeeping Commission works on a voluntary basis. Countries come and say, we're having a problem, and can you help us? And we say, yes, here's a way we'd like to help. We'd become part of the program. And so there's a lot of effort in terms of looking at security reform, looking at pluralism, looking at issues of ethnic conflict and other ways. And we've been able, if you intervene early enough and effectively enough, and sometimes with troops on the ground, and if you carry that through with constant economic assistance and political assistance at the same time, and do it as directly and as positively as you can actually make a difference. Mm. But you should be careful never to declare victory. Never say, "Oh well, that's done." It's like after every referendum we have in Quebec, people say, "Well, that issue is finally over," and I always say to them, "No, don't think this. The issues that give rise to a referendum are done. They're never done. So you've got to always be paying attention to them." And the same thing is true of global governance. How do you do it effectively? By intervening, not less, but by intervening earlier and more effectively. I think that there's often a deep resistance in the country to that kind of intervention. People will often say, "We don't want your help." Mm. There's a particular country whose name I won't mention at the moment because I don't want to preclude any future discussions, where there is serious conflict underway, but there is no willingness to engage on the part of outside countries. Frequently, neighbors too are the ones who are warning, and we should use the neighbors as an early warning system, saying, there's trouble next door, and it's going to affect us. Can you help us? So if you can't come directly to help them, can you please come and help us, so we can begin to learn how we might be able to intervene effectively with the neighbors. That's one of the strategies I think we should be following. Not waiting for the country to come and beg and say, can you help us? but to talk to the neighborhood, to talk to the regional institutions, and say, you have to tell us where our assistance is going to lead to a more resilient response to potential conflict. Yeah, but that's where I think we need to start, and I think, frankly, we're all trying to figure out how do we create a more effective early warning system, and how do we actually pay for it and make it yeah, and process it. Yeah.
Okay, so one last question from me, and my colleagues can start thinking about their questions. We had our graduation on Friday, Ambassador Ray, of our second cohort, and our director Chris Reagan read out the daily news and all of the policy problems that were in the news. And one of our colleagues, Chris told the story, said, yeah, that's why I don't read the newspaper, is because the challenges are just too daunting. I don't want to see them all, right? But you've written about why we can't buckle under the weight of the challenges. We need to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And so the last question for me is really on what kind of work is Canada currently doing and advocating on some of these global problems? If you just want to give us a couple of examples of things that you're really, you have your sleeves rolled up on, as it were.
Well, I've talked about COVID. We do a lot of stuff, behind the scenes in a real effort. We work with other countries trying to do those similar things. We're working very closely with the Netherlands on a number of issues around accountability, around how on gender equality and sexual violence, and which is, it has inevitably become its uptick has become a byproduct of COVID and the impact. I continue to spend a lot of time on particular disputes. The Prime Minister was on the phone yesterday with the Secretary General on Ethiopia, and again, Canada is engaging in, I think, some quite effective and constructive dialogue with the AU and with other regional actors, trying to say how does this play out? How can we reduce the level of violence? And in Myanmar and in Afghanistan, that's taken up a lot of time on the political side. Because of my sort of background, I am enough of a generalist that I'm a lawyer, so I spend time on the ICC. I spend time on accountability issues, on responsibility to protect, and the Genocide Convention, and all kinds of those issues. I spent a lot of time thinking about our social and economic challenges. So we've done a lot of work on the impact of COVID and climate change and the digital revolution on the developing world, and on the way in which it's increased the gap between the rich and the poor. And this is a major preoccupation for me and for Canada. And as I've said before, of course, on peace building and peacekeeping, I was supposed to be going to Seoul on the weekend, but we're going to have the conference virtually to talk about some of our next 5-year commitments on both peacekeeping and peace building. And Canada's really trying to pull those two things together in the system as to how we think about both the hardware and the software as we talk about it, because I do think the two things have to go together.
Fantastic. So you've got a busy calendar. I'm going to open it up to the students. We didn't talk about climate change, but they might, because I know that's a preoccupation of theirs.
Totally.
But I see Fedra first. Fedra, please, if you've got a question for Ambassador Ray. We can't hear you. There you go.
Okay, finally. Sorry. Thank you so much, Ambassador Ray, for for both taking the time to speak with us today, but also for all the work you do on behalf of Canada. As a Canadian, I'm immensely grateful for what you do. My question kind of ties into what you were just saying about how, you were going to have a virtual conference in person in Seoul, but now it's virtual. And so my question is very much related to the nature of your work in the context of the pandemic. And I remember reading a piece, in the early days of the pandemic about how the nature of diplomacy and like the effectiveness of diplomacy, because it was all remote, had taken a hit. Given that diplomacy, a lot of it, is relationships based and kind of happens on the margins and all of that. So I was just curious to hear your perspective. I also know on the flip side, a lot of people whose work is international in nature have benefited from the fact that everything is now online and you can just connect with anybody on Zoom anytime, and it's kind of par for the course now. So I was just curious to hear your take on what that's been like.
I think that's one of those questions where you've answered the question. I think which is great. I mean, that's a good thing. I think you've described the situation perfectly. It's impacted it negatively because you can't connect personally with people as much as you'd like, and international politics is like it's like any politics and diplomacy. It benefits from personal contact. On the other hand, I mean, and I've been talking a bit about the Peace Building Commission today. One of the things that we did when our time came to co-chair the Peace Building Commission was we were there at the creation of Zoom as the methodology of communication, and we said, okay, let's take advantage of technology. Let's use it to allow non-government actors, to allow women peacekeepers, business people, academics, others to come into the room. So, the meetings of the Peace Building Commission are now not, talking heads from government talking to each other, or, before Zoom, people would come to a meeting and physically meet in a room, and you might have a big screen up, but it's not quite the same. But this is a very good way of communicating, and does give people tremendous access. I mean, today I attended a book launch with people in London and Harvard and Oxford. For an hour, a discussion about the contents of the book. Spent time obviously meeting with you, but also having briefing meetings with people in Ottawa where everybody's on the screen. And so it's not all bad. The only problem is you have to be there. You can't really say, sorry, I'm late, I missed my bus. I mean, you're in your room, right? It's not, you can't use all the easy excuses. So yeah, you work hard. I mean, I would say the workload is increased by Zoom, not decreased as a result of it.
Yeah, interesting. Because you're not walking either from.
No.
Well, in New York, it's short blocks, but it's still walking. Naveen, please, a question from you. And then I have a few in the classroom, so I'm going to call on you individually. Naveen, are you there? I cannot hear Naveen. So
just one second,
no,
we're
no,
just
it's
trying to
unmuted.
check if we can unmute her.
Yeah. So the host had muted me, sorry.
Oh, there you are, Naveen. Good.
Yeah. So thank you, Ambassador Ray, for being here with us and sharing your wisdom on the prevailing global affairs. So my question is more related to the Canada-China relationship, especially the economic relationship in the context of the global, geopolitical and economic scenario that is arising post-COVID, especially post-COVID. And I and a couple of my colleagues over here in Maxwell are working on a project on like determining, the contours and the strategy for Canada-China trade as it can happen. So basically, the question is like, what are the red lines or the no-go zones in our Canadian trade relationship with China on which we should not negotiate on? because the opportunities with respect to China are very lucrative, and China increasingly is using trade handle to kind of maneuver its other geopolitical agendas within the global liberal international order. So where do you think Canada should draw the red lines?
Well, I
Here's
think
an
when
easy
you,
one.
that's an easy one. Yeah, I think when you, first of all, I think it's important to stress that the return of China will not be short-lived. So people need to understand that that if we embrace the world, we have to embrace the reality that China is a major presence in the world, and will be a significant trading, economic, and partner of other kinds for us in the years ahead. It's also a dictatorship, and it is a dictatorship that has a particular view of its growing place in the universe, and we have to be wary of that. We have to be aware of it. We have to be alert to it, to the reality of that. I think that, you know, if I would say broadly, and the second point I would make is we're not an entirely independent actor in these decisions, and that's true for everything we do as a country. We're not a superpower, so what we do has to connect with what others are doing. And when I say others, I mean the countries that are closer to us in our economic interests and in our broad political perspectives. So we are part of the West. We are part of North America. We are our most significant trading partner at the present time is the United States. So it's not as if we can waltz into a meeting with the Chinese and say we've decided to do this, this, and this. Thank you. You know, that's our position. We don't have that luxury, and it wouldn't be wise for us to conduct ourselves in that way. We need to be continuing to dialogue with our partners, which we're doing here at the UN, but bilaterally in every way, to say, you know, where do you see this going? How are you responding? How can we maintain our security interests, our collective security interests, which we have, and how do we move forward? So to me, the one test that I would apply would be the test that would say that we would consider something to be a direct risk to our national security, to our security as a country, and to the security of our citizens. That's a very broad brush. It's maybe not a very helpful answer, but I think that, you know, that is the main criterion that I think we have to be looking at and saying this is something we need to be putting on the table all the time. It doesn't necessarily lead to one answer or another with respect to any debate about investment in one thing or another. But I think that we also need to use that in discussions with our friends to say, well, if you're saying to us, you don't want us to develop this or that economic relationship with this particular investment with China, you have to go back to them and say, okay, so what are you prepared to do? Because are you prepared to invest in this? Are you prepared to take on a stronger role in this regard? Because that, I think, is a card we have to be prepared to play.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray.
Okay, I'm going to call on Caroline next, who's in the classroom, I believe. So you'll have to talk loudly so we can hear you.
Hi, Ambassador Ray. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great. I had a question around your work and your thoughts on climate change as a security threat. And I listened to a podcast where you were talking about climate refugees. And I wondered if you could speak to how you would include climate refugees within a UN convention on refugees.
Well, I mean, the refugee lawyers are not keen on taking us down this road. My own response to that is to say, look, I don't have time for a theological argument. My life I don't have that much longer to go. So I'm going to spend time thinking of practical ways in which we recognize the reality that migrants climate migrants are a reality, and we need to understand the impact that is having now, and an even greater impact it's going to have over the next 50 years. I didn't go to COP2, and to give you an idea, I didn't go to COP26, but I was very much involved in working here at the UN on the financing for development and financing for climate change, and was very involved internally inside the government in doing everything to encourage Canada to play a larger role in response to the requests around climate finance. In between COP sessions, here in New York and in Geneva, a lot of what is happening, a lot of what are the regular reports that are coming to us, put us at the center of the discussion. We engage very directly with the issue in that way. As you know, the General Assembly is not a lawmaking body, but our participation here really revolves around things like global security, health security, climate security, where we have this new institution, a relatively new institution called Groups of Friends. And that actually performs a very valuable function. So we're working on issues around migrants and human security with UNHCR, with some of the others in the Secretariat, with a number of countries that are whose security is threatened immediately. So we're working with the South Pacific states on the challenges that they're facing, and we work very directly with them on the human consequences of what it means to lose their land base. Mm-hmm. And when we look at Africa, for example, we see in the Sahel the impact of climate change on relationships between herders and farmers, and all of that growing body of dispute, which also, in the absence of any economic activity, gives rise to much greater dangers of extremism. So yeah, it plays a very big role in our work here.
Okay, we're getting near the end of our time, and I've got lots of questions, so I'm just going to preview who I have. I'm going to go to Mune next, and then Dirk Druitt, who's actually not in the classroom, but who's one of our research affiliates. And there's also a typed question around coming from Raul. So let's start with Mune and Dirk, and then I'll go to Raul's question, and we'll see where we are for time at that point.
I'll keep my answers shorter. How's that?
It's okay. And our questions will keep short. So Mune, you're up. Oh, Mune can't unmute. There we go.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ray, for being here today. So I have a quick question it's with regards to how you think Canada is perceived in the world, and how you might think as well just Canada's foreign policy might need to shift in accordingly. Looking at it from the UN perspective here in New York, I think we're generally speaking well regarded. We pay our way. We're one of the top 10 donors to the UN. We're a contributor. We're a constructive, engaged partner. That's all true, and that's in a way always been true, and it's still true, and that hasn't changed. Where I think we face some tougher choices is, and where perceptions are changing, I think we need to be aware of the fact that the cost of engagement is going to go up. It's like being a member of a club, and they say, well, your dues this year are so much, but if you really want to play it at the heavy table, you've got to be prepared to do more. And that, I think, is something that we have to be prepared to do if we want to be taken even more seriously. And we're going to need to be even more innovative about how we connect with countries that are not necessarily like-minded to us, but with whom we have to deal and talk if we're going to be effective in our diplomacy. We have some rules and restrictions about who we can talk to and how we can talk to them, which frankly makes it more difficult for Canada to be a truly effective mediator and diplomat. And secondly, we need to understand that as I said, that the cost of engagement, well, it doesn't go down, it goes up. And if we're going to be effective in dealing with China here at the UN and elsewhere, we're going to have to invest more. We're going to become a larger presence, a larger staff. And the final, I think, and most difficult question has to do with really trying to figure out how we can embolden not just Canada, but like-minded countries to understand that there's a difference between saying something and doing something. And so there's a lot of, the UN is the home to words, right? It's like the home of rhetoric is the UN. And we all do it. But we need to understand that countries are looking for execution. What are you going to do? What are you actually going to do to follow up these fine and noble thoughts that you have? And to be honest, I think historically, this goes back to Mackenzie King's days, Canada has not always been willing to pay the price of engagement. We've often pulled back at critical moments in peacetime. I think in wartime we've more than paid the price, more than paid up, more than been present. But again, when you talk about are we prepared to pay when what we're trying to do is prevent conflict, that's often been a harder thing to do. And it's not just money; it's also time and attention and focus. There, I think I often, we'll often see instructions from people saying, the success of this event was marked by the fact that Canada was not singled out, for criticism. You sort of say, you hid behind your desk long enough and nothing went wrong. I don't belong to that school of diplomacy.
Interesting one. Yeah. So Dirk, can I just bring you in?
Yes,
Fantastic.
thanks, Jennifer. And thank you so much, Ambassador. This has been really interesting. I wanted to just continue on from what you were just saying, because it seems to point to an ongoing policy debate within Canada or within the Foreign Service on what Canada's role should be. And given this cost that you mentioned and the challenges around, say, Canada's engagement with China, it sort of reminds me of the theory that underpinned Canada's engagement, say, in the Axworthy years, this notion that Canada can punch above its weight by being a strong normative force. And that's the theory that sort of guides Canadian engagement at the UN and in multilateral forums around the world. And I took note of the things that you mentioned that Canada is doing now, in terms of accountability, the ICC, the Peace Building Commission. Of course, there was the brief engagement in MINUSMA in Mali. But it doesn't seem to amount to a coherent strategy. And I think that was reflected in Canada's loss of the council seat. So now that you're here, and we're all very happy you are, is there a strategy to sort of towards the next council seat and something that could compare or contrast to the Axworthy sort of theory of change at the time?
Well, I mean, first of all, on the council seat, I must confess, and maybe I'm a heretic in this regard, the council seat is something we do if we succeed. It's 2 years. And when you think about it, we have not been on the council far, far, far more than we've been on the council. We're not a permanent member of the council. And the other observation I make about the Security Council is it's not working that well. And secondly, it's really dominated by the P5. And so we need to kind of get real about this, the notion somehow that the Security Council is just waiting for Canada to arrive and then it's going to come to life and it's going to do all kinds. I mean, that's not in the program. If and when we decide to go on the Security Council again or put our name forward, there's probably not an opening for at least a decade, and so we need to understand that reality in terms of you can't just rush in and say we're going to run again, in which case you end up in the same situation you were in before. Everybody's committed to another country, all the swaps have been done, and everything else is set. The game is fixed. And you end up losing, and then we say, "Oh, we're losers." I mean, it's a different ball game from what it was when we were getting on this regular rotation of every 10 years, and we need to understand that. On the issue of a strategy, well, I hope we are building it, and to me the theme of it really is. Maybe it's devastatingly simplistic, but I think it's very true. And that is the crisis we are in globally is a crisis that only is satisfied by a global response. And so we have to be at the heart of the reinvigoration of the multilateral project. And there's enough there to chew on. Whether it's COVID, whether it's climate change, whether it's this issue of the digital divide, which I think is increasingly important. The role of cyber, the role of digital is very, very important. And dealing with conflict, which is still, if you like, the core origin of the UN. And you put all those things together, that's a lot. And that's a big project for us. I am not one of those people, and I don't mean to be critical of Lloyd or anybody else, because Lloyd, I think, did an extraordinary amount of work on this concept of human security and how we advance it, and why it's important. And I think we can build on that, because when we talk about the pandemic, that's human security. When we talk about climate change, that's human security. We need to add to it, though, the cost of neglecting human potential, because the economic and social life of the organization is at the lifeblood of what the agencies do. But we still haven't managed to really build on that successfully to create what the Secretary General now calls the common agenda. And I think we can be extremely supportive of what the Secretary General has created in the common agenda. And I think you'll see a more clear narrative emerging from us here in New York and from the government in Ottawa on how we pull all this together. And I come back to my point. My critical point always is, are we really prepared to when you say punch above your weight, well, what exactly are you prepared to do to punch it? Because ironically, the period of time which we were saying this was a period of time when we were probably at our very lowest in our per capita contributions to development assistance. So, when we look more broadly at what the contributions look like now, we're doing a little better. Partly because of what COVID has done and forced us all to do more. It's not just about spending money, but it's about being really prepared to be sufficiently at the table that you're prepared to lead in discussions. And you can't lead in discussions unless you come to the table with more chips. And that, I think, is fundamentally what I believe. And I've been making this point as clearly as I can in all of my discussions on peacekeeping, on COVID, on climate change, on dealing with conflict prevention. Every one of these things requires a significant willingness to contribute, and I think that's going to be exceptionally important.
Fantastic. We have time for just one last question because we promised Sophie and your colleagues that we'd let you go at 1:15. And there's an interesting question that I think ties this together nicely from Raul in the chat about the policy implications of opting for an approach that focuses more on our global interest versus doing the right thing. So Raul asks, are there potential drawbacks or unintended consequences from putting those two things together? So it's really asking about how you might think of it as a juxtaposition of values and interests, but I think it's more about our global interests versus doing the right thing. And how you think about that when we're talking to Canadians in particular and others about needing to step up with our contribution.
Well, I mean, I guess it's my background in politics as essentially, I hope what I hope would be described as a pragmatist with principles. I don't regard it. I regard this thing about saying, are we doing the right thing or are we only doing what's in our interest? I don't think people normally do things against their own interests that are directly contrary to their interests. I think it's very difficult for individuals to do that. And I think it's very difficult for countries, particularly for democratic countries, to do that with popular support. However, that doesn't mean that we don't have principles or don't have values or don't try and do the right thing. If you do, you've got to think about not just what you're doing, but the consequences of what you're doing and the time frame and the persistence with which you do it. And that's, I think, when we talk about leadership, one of the jobs of leaders is to say to people when you're halfway up the hill, is to say, we're halfway up the hill and we still have to keep going. And let's remember why we're going. Why are we going up to the top of this hill? And you better have an answer, right? You better say, this is why we're doing it. It's a good idea. It's a right thing to do. The kind of moral solidarity which we need to express in the world today, and I think solidarity is the most single required virtue in global politics today. It is absolutely the sine qua non of our global need at the moment. It's not just an empty virtue or one where we do the right thing and everybody's grateful to saying, oh, good old Canada's, providing us with the moral conscience. It's because this is necessary. Solidarity is necessary at the present time. It's necessary to save lives. If we don't express greater solidarity, greater empathy and understanding, we're going to lose a lot of people and a lot of what that represents in terms of our obligations our moral obligations to each other. I don't see these things as opposites, and I'm doing a lot more reading these days and in thinking about the importance of consequential thinking, the importance of looking at the consequences of what we do, and the consequences of the processes that we say this is a just process. You say, well, the process has to be fair, but it also has to be one which leads to a just result. And I think the other one is, and it's a very deep value of mine, is that doing better is much better than doing the best and failing. Doing better and succeeding is better than trying for the umpteenth perfect answer and not getting there because you can't get there. And you might say, well, that was the virtue of trying, but I don't believe in that. I believe much more that incremental progress is progress, and if it's in the right direction, it's better than the alternatives.
Those are wise words to end on. Also for students, doing better is doing good. But also this call for solidarity, which I've been teaching a class on global policy Ambassador Ray this term, and we've been looking at different domains where solidarity is required. So thank you for reminding us of that. Thank you for being with us, but most of all, thank you for what you do. Thank you for your public service over all these years, but especially now in such a challenging time. We are very lucky to have you in New York, and it's a real pleasure to have welcomed you to the Max Bell School.
Well, it's great to be with you. It's great to visit virtually with you at McGill, an institution I unfortunately never attended, but I understand it's a good university, so I'm glad.
Yes.
Delighted to be in your company, and it's great to have a chance to chat with all of you.
And we'll have you here in person someday.
I'd love to come. It's only a 6-hour drive from New York.
Indeed. Have a wonderful day to you, rest of your day. And
Thank
to
you.
everyone online, thank you for attending and being with us.
Thank you so much. Nice to be with you. Take care.